All right. We are gathered here for Maria Harle's thesis defense. We're all eager to hear her discuss the importance of accepting failure with grace.
Thank you so much. I'd like to give a special thanks to my panel, Ms. Flynn, who's taught me in elementary school, and Mr. Andrew and Dr. Roth, who taught me throughout high school. You guys have literally been with me every step of the way. I would also like to thank my parents for being here and the people that missed class to be here and everyone on Zoom. I really appreciate you all being here. The idea for my thesis originated from Hamlet. For me, I was fascinated with the actual acting and performance around it, because as most of you know me, you know that acting and performing is my passion. Being in front of a crowd is where I feel the most confident. But after talking with Mr. Sheps and taking his recommendation to read Death of a Salesman, my attention was turned away from the spectacle of performance to the literature behind these stories. Both Hamlet and Death of a Salesman are tragedies, but what exactly makes them tragic? I first came across my overarching questions in the parking lot of Second Ponce Baptist Church. While thinking over the lessons from Hamlet and Death of a Salesman, I realized that even though these two characters live in completely different settings and time periods, they both experience the same range of emotions. Specifically, they both had the same response to how they handle loss and failure. So I thought to myself, what exactly led to these characters' losses? Could they have been avoided? What was the appropriate response to failure? Here, I would also like to mention that talking about loss and failure can be a depressing subject. However, that is not my intention. My goal for this project was to work out a way for a person to be strengthened by their losses and not brought to ruin by it. Now, back to answering my initial questions. I first had to consider the different types of losses. Losses can range from a simple mistake like getting a bad grade on a test to the most catastrophic defeats like losing a war. In order to take into consideration all these types of losses, I narrowed down the variety of losses into three categories: self-inflicted, unforeseen, and accidental, all of which are based upon the character and circumstance. Though losing can be categorized in these different ways, what ties them together is the suffering, anger, and sorrow they all inflict on the figure. A first example to show an accidental loss is Beauty and the Beast by Madame de Villeneuve. As Beast's father roams Beast's garden, he takes a rose for his daughter. This one action results in him giving up his daughter for months. However, taking this rose was a complete mistake, and he had no intention of harming the Beast. As another example, in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, Willie Loman's failure is self-inflicted. Willie is an ineffective salesman who refuses to change his ways to adapt to the changing culture of New York salesmen. Instead of updating his practice or changing professions, his pride and stubbornness keep him in a place of failure. This is what makes Death of a Salesman a tragedy. On the other hand, Hamlet's loss is completely unforeseen, as he wrestles with the death of his father. However, what makes Hamlet a tragedy is the downward spiral that Hamlet experiences as a result of his loss. He goes mad and directly causes the death of everyone he loves, including himself. This is what makes Hamlet a tragedy. Though these three examples are decades apart and take place in separate parts of the world, what ties them together is the suffering and sorrows of their failures and losses. Specifically, both Hamlet and Willie Loman chose a counterproductive response to their loss, which brought me to answer the next of my initial questions. What is the appropriate response to failure? Once a person has suffered a failure or a loss, that person can respond in one of two ways: gracefully or in a counterproductive manner. A graceful response consists of humility, honesty, and admission of defeat on some level. On the other hand, a counterproductive response is the exact opposite, where a person turns to violence or spitefulness. One example that came to mind when thinking of a figure that accepted failure with grace is Abraham Lincoln. Specifically, I examined his loss to Stephen Douglas in the 1858 race for senator for Illinois. He accepted failure in a few key ways. He chose not to blame anyone around him. He used humor to show his humility, and he chose to see his failure as, and I quote, a slip, not a fall. These are just a few examples of accepting failure with grace. On the other hand, the two examples I gave previously of Hamlet and Willie Loman demonstrate a counterproductive or self-destructive response to loss. As I said before, Willie chose to live in the past instead of updating his practices, and Hamlet chose to take revenge on his uncle. Here, I would like to highlight the word choice. In all these examples, these figures chose their response to loss. The choice is the key to accepting failure with grace or falling into a self-destructive pit of despair. This moves me into the most important section of my thesis, how to move past a loss. This is by far the most challenging part of the failing process. Everything I've presented thus far sounds great in theory, but is so much harder to accomplish in practice. This is where a person must make the hard choice to accept failure with grace, rather than giving in to the temptation to respond with anger or revenge. Responding with grace will always be a better option than responding out of heated passion. Responding with grace will shorten the failing process significantly, while responding with self-destructive manners will only lengthen the process. Therefore, a person must reconcile himself to the possibility of failure and accept it as a part of life. Losing is the hardest part of life. However, loss and failure are universal experiences. Every day, people fail on every scale. Therefore, a person must reconcile himself to the possibility of failure and must know how to fail in the best way possible in order to minimize suffering. Every type of failure leads to suffering. However, every type of failure can be redeemed by grace. Losing should not be seen as a detriment, but rather as a new opportunity to learn and grow from an unfortunate circumstance. Every loss opens a new space for grace and an opportunity to see the world with more optimism. Experiencing a loss should never lead to total annihilation. Rather, a person should grieve their loss in a constructive way and become stronger afterward. Literature and history have shown many examples of graceful and self-inflicted losses and prove that losing gracefully will always be superior to self-inflicted loss. Self-inflicted losses can only lead to more suffering. Graceful losses are what allow growth and development. Even if human emotions lead toward self-inflicted losses, a person must harness the self-control to minimize the possibility of further suffering and make the choice to be graceful. Life is not just a collection of victories and highs. Life is a collection of experiences that comes from both the highs and the lows. Without the losses, victories would have no meaning. Therefore, coming to terms with and accepting a loss is the first step to earning another victory. Both literature and history show many examples of loss and failure, but a graceful response to loss is what distinguishes the hopeless from the heroes. Thank you.
Right, thank you for that, Maria. Yeah, I think you are giving excellent advice to everyone about how to take a loss, but as is well known, advice is easy to give, but hard to take. Can you think of any personal experiences where either you have tried to console someone confronting loss and defeat, or where someone has similarly tried to console you when facing adversity? And can you think of any advice about how to do that, about how to advise, how to console and advise someone at a very difficult time?
Absolutely. I think there's a few key ways you can do that. Part of being a good friend is listening to what someone has to say. There's two parts to that. You can either listen to what they say and just be there as a person to listen to them, or you can take the other side and actually offer advice and help for that. Both ways, I think, are great ways of helping someone start that losing process and start it off well in a graceful way that revolves around talking rather than acting on emotions and anger.
Now, it seems to me that an important component of that is simply waiting in order not to respond with passion, but rather with reasoned restraint. A large part of that is waiting until those passions subside, whether it's shame or anger over the defeat or whatever negative feelings may arise. Do you agree with that?
I do think so. Patience is also a big part of this, which can only be harnessed through this type of self-control you were talking about. Like I said, losing and failing is a process, and processes do take time and patience.
Now, I'm especially interested in your treatment of Hamlet, because Hamlet is in a very awkward position. It's first of all, he has to conclude whether his father has been murdered, and then he has to decide what the proper course of action is for that. Now, clearly, things do not end well for Hamlet, but in your mind, what would have been a happy ending for him? Because it seems to me that if he reconciles himself to his uncle, then they'd be one big happy family. But at the cost of the fact that Hamlet knows that his uncle murdered his father. So in that case, would the reconciliation and the peace come at the price of the truth?
I see what you're saying in that. And sort of like the question you just asked before, it is a process. There's no way that that could have happened like in a week, in a month. That's something that takes years of practice to understand. And yes, he would have sacrificed truth, but I feel like at the same time he could have accepted the truth and then start the grieving process and then start the losing process. The truth should not have led him to his passions and his anger taking over him. Rather, his truth should have led him into reconciling himself.
So is that to say that his desire for revenge, or would you say that any desire for revenge would be unjustified?
I think so. I really do. Really taking control of yourself is, I think, the first step to resolve any sort of conflict.
So it strikes me as a very Christian attitude, one of turning the other cheek and leaving vengeance for the Lord. You look at it through that prism?
I mean, I guess I didn't consider it before, but yeah, that makes sense.
Jump in if I may. So throughout the paper, you mentioned humility, service, self-government. Perseverance kind of is implied throughout. And I was thinking, in elementary school, we have the virtues just punched on the wall. And so many of the school virtues and virtues in general just seem absolutely necessary to overcome failure. It almost seems like there's so much preparation that's necessary in order to fail well, if you will. So what does that look like practically? Like, how do we prepare ourselves? We know we're going to encounter failure at some point in our life. What do we need to do beforehand to prep ourselves for that? And ought we do something beforehand to prep ourselves?
Yeah. Miss Wiggin, the strings teacher here at ACA, she was talking to myself and the other strings class. And she was talking in terms of music, but I think what she said really applies to a broader scale. She said that when we play, we cannot be afraid to make a mistake. She said that when you play music, you are going to play a wrong note, you're going to play off beat, but that's just going to happen. But you just keep going through it. And so keeping to go through it, and then you're going to make mistakes along the way. But that means that you can then go back, find the places, the measure, the line that you did do well, practice that, and then put it back into the rest of the piece. And so I really like what she said about not being afraid to fail. So keeping all of these virtues in mind, equipping those to yourself, I think takes away some of the fear of facing challenges and failure.
So is it a matter of temperament? Is it like, how do you practically, what is that? So you don't want to be afraid of failure, but how do I create that bravery in the face of failure? Like what is necessary? Like, I'm truly wondering, okay, I'm going to encounter failure. What's my guidebook? What I have to do? Is it a matter of just personality, of just I'll just go with the flow of it? What would you say, looking at your education, what would you say has helped you? You mentioned in the paper how you've encountered various moments of failure yourself. What in your history has led you to be able to fail well?
Yeah. Just going straight into it,
Mhm.
honestly, you know, like I said earlier, failure is something that cannot be avoided, even if we do try, and you know, we all try to not fail. But knowing that and being okay with that idea is, I think, what will lead you to then fail gracefully in the end.
Can I ask one more and then I'll pass it over to Mr. Andrew? Can you define, so you use gracefully throughout this? And I would just love you to explain it. So every type of failure can be redeemed by grace, and then you talk about losing gracefully.
Yeah.
Would you talk a bit more about, like, just define grace and
Grace,
use it in
right.
the
Right.
essay?
Right. So I use grace as sort of like a catch-all term that means anything that's not the result of violence or hatred or anger or things like that. So, you know, like the example I was talking about earlier, talking through it with another person, that is a graceful response because it's not a response out of anger, it's a response out of just talking.
Thanks, Maria. I want to go to the first line of the paper where you cite a famous quotation from Kennedy following his failure at the Bay of Pigs, where he says that success has 1,000 fathers, but failure is an orphan. Can you just unpack that quotation for me? What does that mean?
Totally. So what I think you're saying here is that success is something that we all want. Success is something that we all want to be a father to. We all want to like be responsible for our successes and take pride in our successes. But no one wants to have a failure. People want to give up their failures. People want to leave their failures as an orphan. Yeah.
So what is his relationship to this particular failure? What is he claiming?
So
what is he accepting? What is he embracing?
Yeah, accepting the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he is the father of this orphan. Right. Is what he's saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So one of the things I'm trying to wrap my head around with your paper is the relationship between failure and loss.
Mhm.
You seem to use these things interchangeably, and I want to understand whether or not that's what you intend and the implications of that intention. So first, to that direct question, are failure and loss the same thing in your mind?
The way that I used it in this paper, yes, it is. However, I think maybe a better distinction would have been loss is like maybe something that happens to you. Loss is something, that happened to you, but failure, you took part in something and you did not accomplish it.
Yeah, right. So you named 3 different categories for loss: self-inflicted losses, which reads as a kind of failure. If you've done it, you have agency. Unforeseen, which is perhaps somewhere in the middle. And then there are the accidental ones.
Yeah.
Is there a risk in an accidental loss being read as a failure? Right. So you give the example of the father from Beauty and the Beast accidentally picking this rose. Though perhaps that's a crime of a kind. So that's not even a perfect accidental failure, right? Like you could maybe read that as having a higher level of intention. But the things that are truly like profoundly accidents, what's the risk of reading those as failures? And then on the other side, what's the reward of it? Like why you're advocating for us to read them as failures. So just treat both those things. What's the risk of reading accidental losses as failures, and what's the value in it?
Yeah. So reading accidents as failures, I can see where that would not work out the best way, because accidents, you don't mean to do it. And, like I just said, for failure, it's like you took a part in it. So I see that's the downside of it. The upside of it is the accidents and failures are all linked to suffering and linked to sadness. And so they all sort of inflict those types of emotions on the person.
But in processing your grief, in processing your suffering, does it matter whether you define it as a kind of accidental loss then, or a deserved one, because failure is failure? Like I'm thinking of my 3-year-old who loves to tell me now that anything he does wrong was an accident. He like hit his brother in the head with a bat the other day. He's like, accidents happen, Dad. Accidents happen. Like every sin is an accident in his mind. Yeah, does it matter? Or is it just failure is failure either way? And no matter the nature of the loss, no matter what occasioned this failure, you should always look at it through the same lens.
So I think accidents and failures are sort of tied together in the same way that you still take accountability for both of them. You still, I hit my brother with a bat over the head,
Mhm.
even if it was an accident,
Yeah.
I still have to reconcile that in some way. Same way, if it was a failure, I still have to make it up in some way.
Can you think of a category of accident that you shouldn't take accountability for?
Not really, not right now, at least.
Well, I'm imagining that the spirit of Vince Lombardi is here among us right now. Who's most famous for saying winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. And I'm wondering about the implications of your ideas upon any type of competition. And I'm thinking, what would a good coach do, whether it's in football or track or any competitive endeavor? Or even a strings teacher. What is the best coach going to say, and at halftime say, okay, we're down, but everyone's playing really well, hang in there, do your best? Or is the good coach the one who's going to rant and rave and say, what's wrong with you? And do everything in his power to like terrify you into doing better. So for the purposes of trying to induce achievement, trying to lead individuals to greatness, and trying to achieve the exact opposite of failure. Is it necessary for the coach and even for the participant to adopt maybe temporarily a different attitude? That failure is not an option, that I need to do whatever it takes to win in order to inspire himself towards that achievement?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the example you were giving of a coach down at halftime, that is sort of like you need a mix of encouragement and also strong will, because you can encourage these people like, you're down, but it's okay, you're playing well, but at the same time you also need to, like, I don't have a better word for it, but hype them up for going into next half.
But I mean, it seems that there's an inherent difficulty though in trying to inspire greatness. You have to imply that failure is a terrible fate, nothing's worse than that. But at the same time, if you want to admit the possibility of failure and say, well, winning isn't everything. By doing so, are you undercutting that first argument? Are you, which is to say, by leaving yourself an escape route, are you making it less likely that you will succeed, that you will be victorious in the end?
I don't think so. It really has to do with your will and how badly you want it. Saying failure is not an option, it always is, but if that's the mentality that you want to go into this endeavor, to make yourself more confident, to be brave and push through it, then there's no problem with that at all.
I think so, but isn't there a lie in that? If you're saying to yourself, failure is not an option, when clearly, I mean, it always is a possibility.
Yeah.
Is there any downside to, is that a noble lie that you're telling yourself and you'll keep telling it to yourself until you can no longer until it either comes true or you can no longer disguise the fact that it is a lie?
Sure. I mean, there's a line that you can draw in that. You can encourage yourself to keep going even through failing, even through losing so many times. But at the same time, there also is a point where you should give up. Like Aristotle talks about excess and deficiency, and being on either side is not the way you want to be. You want something in the middle. The ability to keep going is very noble, but also knowing when to stop is equally as noble.
I'm curious about the relationship between failing well and pride. So it seems to me that in order to fail well, their humility is absolutely necessary. And it's interesting too, right? How do you reconcile that with what he was just talking about before with this strong sense of competition? So could you just talk a bit about that? What is the connection between pride and failure, or the kind of antithesis between them?
Well, failing is sort of like what directly goes against your pride.
Mhm.
Failing is what hurts your pride. Failing is what will bring you down. But having faith in yourself, having pride in yourself is, I think, what then leads to the failing process where you can begin to start coming back better.
So it seems in order to fail well, you have to first kind of prepare yourself by kind of by seeking out humility, like by nurturing a lack of arrogance, perhaps.
Right.
There's a great quote from To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'm going to butcher it, but it's something like, when you go into a situation and you know you're going to fail, but you go in anyway.
Yeah.
And I've always loved that. I think it's what etiquette. But what is the benefit of suffering? So you were just talking about, okay, should you even consider suffering when you're going, or losing when you're going into a game or something like that? And I guess my question is, should we actually seek it out? Is suffering, is losing and suffering actually, like you said, it's a necessary thing, it's going to just happen, but is it actually something that we should be grateful for? What does it do for us?
Yeah, I think maybe before knowing you're going to lose before you go into something, that is going to be the challenging part. But after failing, it's like you now know where the bottom is. So that means that like you can take that and only go upward from there. Like I say in my conclusion, that like life is highs and lows. We can't always be on a constant high without any low. That would give the highs no meaning. So attaching a meaning to the suffering that you're maybe about to experience, already have experienced, are in the middle of experiencing, that gives meaning to then the victory that you experience on the other side of it.
So is victory always the aim? Like when you say victory, because you use it throughout your paper, is victory, would you always define it as a lack of failure, or could victory somehow be intertwined with failing well, if you will?
I think so, because I mean, like I said, victory or like life is like highs and lows. It's like you need both of them to experience a more full life. Having all highs and no lows, it gives the highs really no meaning. Of course, on the other end, and having all lows, no highs, that also gives life no meaning.
What do you do for a person? So like with the example of Lincoln, I thought, well, that's all good and well. He goes on to, win the presidency and all that. What do you do for a person who, and to be fair, his life, he did struggle and life was not quite happy for him. But what do you do for a person where they're never actually getting those victories in a worldly sense, in a material world, and a success in the eyes of the world? They never achieve that sort of victory. Is loss still worth it? Is failure still valuable, even if they're never achieving in the eyes of the world any sort of particular glory or anything like that?
I mean, I like the phrase you used, in the eyes of the world. I feel like that sort of relates to maybe the opposite side of that, the value for themselves. Even in losing positions, you could still see value in yourself, even if no one else sees it.
So for, I haven't read Death of a Salesman. Is it Willy Loman? Okay. So for him, since he's putting his identity in his job rather than in his, like, it's the greatest wrong, not that he's not adapting, but in that he's putting his worth and value, his identity in the role itself.
Yes, yeah, I see what you're saying. So he's kind of doing the like excess of what I just said. He's putting too much pride in himself, too much pride in the way that he's doing it, in the way that he wants it done, rather than thinking through it and thinking of changing, thinking of adapting to the way that New York is changing.
So he should have sought success in the worldly sense of it.
Yeah.
And so his failure was a failure of not. Do you see what I'm saying?
I
Like
see what you're saying, yeah. But at the same time, he really saw I don't think that he saw pride in himself.
Okay.
I think he was more stubborn in the way that he wants to do it. He saw it as the right way to do it, not really the way that like he wanted to do it.
I want to return to my last question because I'm still just a little bit perplexed about the relationship between failure and loss. Can you just say a little bit more about the potential dangers of reading every one of your losses in life as a failure? And I'm thinking about Hamlet right now, whose first loss is the death of a father,
Yeah.
which could in no way be construed to be a failure.
Yeah.
What are the risks of, for instance, Hamlet viewing his father's murder as a personal failure?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So Hamlet's father dying, that was his initial loss. However, I think that everything after that was his failure.
Sure.
The way that he chose to respond to it resulted in him losing even more. He chose to fake madness and then actually mad. He chose to take revenge, and all those choices were failures that just kept adding up.
Is there any way though that terrible train of events could originate with misreading an initial loss as a failure? Which is to say, if you are able to distinguish losses from failures and acknowledge where you don't have agency, you don't have control, you can actually free yourself up from a great host of suffering.
Say that last part again.
Yeah, what I'm sort of pointing at is if I'm someone who views every one of my losses as failures, which means that I basically take full and entire responsibility for every bad thing that happens to me, whether I earned it or not, how is that going to reshape the way that I read reality, that I read just my daily experience? And what's the risk of that?
Yeah, I mean, the risk of that is that you are almost like always in a state of failure.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's like you go into everything thinking that this is the worst thing possible. Every day is just awful. But the other side is that you also have to realize, you know, accidents do happen to you, losses do happen to you. It's not always going to be your fault.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, what I'm poking at here is like you are recommending a kind of responsibility that is at the extreme.
Yeah.
To name losses as failures, to use those words interchangeably, is to encourage us, the listeners, to be very quick to claim responsibility in every instance of encountering difficulty.
Yeah.
Like I'm late to work and I happen to hit a red light,
Yeah.
which is like a bummer because I'm 2 minutes behind. And you're saying like, no, of course that red light is just sort of like happening to you, but you need to take responsibility for that. You need to, is this what you're recommending? Is it this sort of extreme sort of mandate to be responsible for everything all the time, whether it's a matter of happenstance or actually a matter of will that led you to a particular situation?
Yeah. You know, I don't think that you are like responsible for that red light. But yeah, no, you're not responsible for every single thing. And so really distinguishing what is failing and what is losing, what were accidents that just happened to you, or where were you in the wrong, that is sort of
Sure. Let me ask this. There's this old cliche that your failures don't define you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you disagree with that. I'm wondering if you would say that in fact your failures do define you.
I guess I kind of would disagree with that. Because, you know, like I was talking with Miss Flynn just a minute ago, it's highs and lows, you know? Failing implies that you tried in the first place. I think trying was also just as noble as maybe not just as, but close to just as noble as actually winning.
Is that to say that it's not failure per se that defines you, but your response to failure that
Absolutely.
defines you?
Yeah.
It also strikes me that probably could have maybe cleared or clarified your terminology a bit. If we had defined loss, it seems the way you use it, loss is kind of a combination of misfortune and failure.
Yeah.
So the bad things that happen to us just by happenstance of misfortune counts as loss, but also our own individual failures count as loss as well.
Yeah.
And because in either case, you can respond to those productively or counterproductive, whether you are at fault or whether there's simply an accident. As with the case with the death of Hamlet's father, he's not responsible for that in any way, but still there's the question of how he responds to that. Is that going to crush him, or is he going to reconcile himself to it and grow as a person from that experience? Now, earlier when you were talking about in what your response to Miss Flynn's question, and you were talking about how we grow through suffering, it strikes me that that is very much the thesis of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And it's interesting that in your thesis, you didn't bring up Viktor Frankl at all.
Yeah.
Well, your advisor had pointed that out.
Yeah, only, I guess. But no, I do really appreciate the lessons from Man's Search for Meaning, and I do think that it applies very well to this. Finding the meaning in suffering and then growing from that is a great lesson. Viktor Frankl mentions he had this patient that he was always depressed, he was always upset because his wife died, and he just had no reason to keep going. It was just, life was just so much harder for him. And then Viktor Frankl recommended, well, flip that the other way. If you had died and she had survived, she would have been sad. You are taking on the burden of that sorrow, of that sadness. And I really liked that example a lot, because the meaning that he gave to suffering, then changed that man, and he was almost completely healed after that. And so turning your suffering into then a positive, into a win, is a great lesson. Yeah.
I'm curious about a hypothetical scenario and how you would react to it. So imagine something like someone maybe even someone you consider a friend, tries to take credit for something that you yourself did. And there are two ways to respond. One way is to bring up the issue, and the other is to let it go. And if you bring up the issue, there's the potential for conflict. If you simply let sleeping dogs lie, then perhaps that could be considered a failure of sorts. In a scenario like that, which course of action would you recommend? Would it be better to assert the truth at the price of conflict, or would it be better to, I suppose, try to take the loss or the failure, or however you want to call it, and learn from that?
Yeah, I think that goes back to what Ms. Flynn asked earlier about going into something knowing that conflict will come out the other side, knowing that loss will come out the other side. But I do think that is something noble, because you are searching for the truth, and the truth is sort of the beginning to becoming better, both for yourself and for the other person that's hypothetical.
So in this case, would it be by asserting the truth of what happened and forcing the other person to take the loss? You would be helping them grow through their own defeat.
Yeah.
No. Like I said, the advice you give is generally good advice, but is there the potential that acceptance of loss will lead to complacency, or even in the long run become a self-fulfilling prophecy? That if you want to create for yourself an escape route of maintaining always the possibility of failure, does that escape route eventually overwhelm your positive plans to accomplish something?
Can you say that again?
So if you've already reconciled yourself to the possibility of defeat and how it's not the end of the world, does that encourage complacency? Are you giving yourself a get out of jail free card in that way by assuming justifying the potential for failure, in that you can grow from failure, or failure doesn't mean everything? But I mean, could that attitude, which could be a very positive attitude, could it be a harmful attitude if taken to an extreme?
Yeah, definitely if it's taken to an extreme, but I don't think anyone wants to stay complacent. Everyone wants to win. Everyone wants to achieve some sort of victory. And being okay with the concept of failure does not mean that you don't also want to win at the same time.
No idea. Yeah. I'd like to talk about Death of a Salesman for a while. I have not read the play myself, but you seem to think that Willie, if he so chose, could embrace a new life. He could get out of the rut that he's dug himself into. But that attitude reminds me of a line that has long since become a cliche, which is learn to code. Which is to say that if you're not doing well financially, if you are dealing with failure in your professional life, embark on a new profession. Once again, I mean, it sounds easy, but in practice, it can be very difficult. So, I mean, is it clearly Willie's fault that he doesn't change, or has he reached an age where change is difficult?
Yeah, I do think it's a mix of both. He initially sticking with maybe what you're familiar with and staying by what you believe in is a good thing. But like I said earlier, there comes a point where you need to stop and you need to understand that maybe you yourself are wrong, even if that's what you believed in.
All right. Well, Ms. Flynn, Mr. Andrew, do you have any final questions or comments for Maria?
I really enjoyed reading this, and I think it's a great thing to consider. Is you're young and have life ahead of you, just to realize that suffering is not the end all be all, and that there's good in it. Love that you spent time on this.
I want to ask a really quick question,
Oh, yeah.
and then I'm going to make a comment. For those sitting in the room for whom failures are not quickly coming to mind, which is to say they don't really feel like they've failed at very much, do you have any advice for them?
I mean, that's great. You haven't failed very much, but
Is it great though?
sure, because it means you've had a maybe relatively good life, but that doesn't mean that failures are not going to come in near future, far future. And so just be okay with that. Be okay with failing.
Yeah, I think this paper sort of reveals two things about you. One is that you are a person who tries. Like, you try really hard at all the things that are in front of you.
You make me cry.
Yeah, it's okay. Right? You really genuinely care. And whether it is a sports team, it is a class, it's an institution, you're going to give everything that you've got, which means that you're going to encounter failure. And those that don't encounter failure are often those that don't try, those that hide, right? Those that sort of protect themselves from any kind of risk. And the second thing that I think you reveal about yourself is that you are a person who tries, and you are also a person who expects much of the people around you. That you expect the world to be just, that you expect institutions to be good. And when they fail to be that, it causes you suffering. It makes you feel as though you have lost something and that you yourself have failed. To be a person who tries and to be a person who expects the world to be good is to be a person who will suffer. That is just an inevitability. It's like one of the most noble and profound things to look upon that difficulty, to look upon that suffering and say, this is its own source of meaning, which is, I think, the thing that you're doing, right? You are taking the gift of yourself, which is that you love things deeply and you want the best of things. And you are sort of reconciling yourself to the challenge that necessarily brings and saying, this too will bring meaning and purpose in my life, which I think is going to serve you well for a really, really long time. And is such an important and mature observation.
Yes, and your thesis has come at a very opportune time for me because I have to give a talk to ninth graders tomorrow about the test they just took and how their ninth grade life already does not define them as a person. But hopefully they'll be able to grow from the experience and draw the right lessons from it. And I need to draw some own lessons. During your defense, thinking of all these topics that I could have shared with you as an advisor to improve your thesis, or not improve, but at least to give you more food for thought. So yes, I'll have to try to be a better thesis advisor. At least I have 24 hours to work with Jack now. But as a sign of success, I want to give you the certificate from the National Latin Exam for cum laude achievement on the highest level of the National Latin Exam.
Great job, Maria. Yeah,
Thank you.
Roll that.
Thank you.